saw it yesterday on Jerusalem Post.
Well, I must have missed that bit.
But I've seen some I would not believe a year ago.
Well, I mean, yes. And it is maybe going to work. Let me pop out the chat. And let's get back to Zoom there. And we might as well start sharing the screen that has the Mishnah. There we go. All right. Mostly ready to go. Just waiting for more people.
So, Rabbi, in rabbinic school, did they make you break down the Mishnahs like they do at the conservative synagogue in Jerusalem?
You mean, do we study the Mishnah like line by line?
Well, they break them down, which is the only place I've seen that really does that.
What do you mean by
statement?
What's that?
They break them down into statement by statement.
Well, you mean like the way the commentary is written in the English explanation?
Kind of, but they say, you know, Rabbi so-and-so says this, and then they bullet point and then before. So it's like it's chunked into each idea and not one big paragraph.
Well, I mean, it's important to understand that no matter where you study Mishnah, whether it's presented as one paragraph or whether it's presented line by line with explanation, when you're actually in a class, you are going to get line by line and sometimes word by word explanation. The Mishnah text that we have is meant to be remembered. It's not meant to be the end and beginning of understanding. Or beginning and end, I guess, would be the correct direction.
Yeah, when we were in law school, we had to do that in the beginning. We had to take the statutes and break them down, each element of a crime or each point of a crime. So instead of just reading one big statute, you had to actually lay out what they had to prove. So
right.
It looked similar to what the conservative synagogue of the conservative yeshiva synagogue did.
But if you mean the archive on the Fuchsberg Center in Jerusalem, that's actually an archive of the translation and explanation that we have on the right-hand side of the screen right now.
Right.
But that was actually written.
They didn't break it down into bullets.
What's that?
They just didn't break it down into bullets.
Got it. But yeah, breaking down the Mishnah, I mean, that's the whole point of what the Talmud eventually does. And the Talmud will go line by line or word by word to wrestle and uncover what each phrase means.
I'm actually going to pull it up.
So the thing to remember about all rabbinic texts is they are essentially, to use the modern technology term, they are zip files. They are compressed data, meaning that you study the text and you unpack it, and then your mind will understand what the whole unpacking is, even when you remember just the short version. Because you can't write a book that's 100% exhaustive, and you can't remember 100% or 100% for a 100-page essay, but you can remember the essay if you remember the paragraph.
Well, actually, the Conservative Synagogue website appears to be down.
That's new. I haven't checked it in a while, but all right. Well, I'm not seeing anyone else logging into Zoom. We've got our folks that are on the, what do you call it? Folks who are on the, too many tabs. Folks who are on the YouTube stream. So I think we're going to go ahead and get rolling. So we are in chapter 6 of Mishnah Eruvin. As my continued public service announcement, this is going to be our last class for about 4 weeks, as I'll be having some time off. So if you don't see me next week, that's why. But it will resume after, just reminding myself of the date. On the 16th of July is when we will have our next class. So we'll get through as much of chapter 6 as we can, but don't cry if we don't finish, because we'll be back to it. So we are beginning in chapter 6 to really go into more detail about these courtyard and then later on alleyway partnerships, Eruvin, that are linking together these households into a collective zone in which things can be carried and moved on Shabbat. So we are moving away from the conversation we'd had about your Eruv for walking, and now we're dealing with the Eruv for carrying. I know it's confusing that they're both called, an Eruv, but we just have to deal with the duplicated language, and that's not unusual in any language to have one word meaning more than one case. So this point from chapter 6 on for a number of more chapters, we're going to be dealing with this issue of carrying from courtyard, from house within a courtyard to another house within the same courtyard, and also eventually from one house from one courtyard into an alleyway, or into the alleyway and then into another courtyard off the same alleyway. So that's our frame. So set aside some of what you have learned about the walking Eruv. This is the carrying Eruv section.
So today is our last shiur for a month, correct?
Yes, as I mentioned just a few minutes ago, we will resume classes in July on it was the 16th, I believe, but I've already forgotten because who keeps track of English dates? Yes, the 16th.
Who keep track of vacations? Everyone.
No, English date. Who keeps track of English dates? And yeah, I don't need to know exactly, because we're not really traveling this vacation, I don't need to know exactly when it finishes, the same way as if I was getting an airplane. But no airplanes for this vacation.
Virtual one with Cheyenne.
All right, so let's go ahead and pick up with chapter 6, Mishnah 1. As I just mentioned, and I'll repeat it again because I don't want people to get confused, we are talking here about a courtyard and the carrying within a courtyard. And because it's been a lot of weeks, I'm just going to do a very quick sketch to understand what a courtyard looks like. All right, a courtyard in the ancient world was a collection of houses. Oh, now just imagine that lines up. A collection of houses, you go there, that would all have separate homes that would share a common space, and that common space would then have an opening into the street. There would be some kind of archway that you would then go out into the main, alleyway, as we'll see later, or onto the main public road. So right now we're dealing with a courtyard situation for the first Mishnah of chapter 6. So it's just inside these walls and these shared homes. Good, good, good. All right, so one who lives in a courtyard with a non-Jew or with one who does not acknowledge the principle of Eruv, behold, this one restricts him from making use of an Eruv. These are the words of Rebbe Meir. All right, let's get this clear. In order for there to be an Eruv within a courtyard, there has to be an agreement among the residents of the courtyard. Well, if somebody is not Jewish, they cannot enter into this agreement, right? They don't have legal standing with regards to this particular mitzvah. And so too, somebody who rejects the idea of Eruv cannot and will not enter into an agreement regarding the Eruv for the courtyard. So according to Rebbe Meir, because they won't join, that means they don't relinquish the space that is shared, the courtyard. they're not willing to join into a shared ownership of it. And therefore, you cannot carry from your house out into the courtyard.
But can you ignore him because he's not a Jew and rule only between Jews?
Okay, so Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov says, one can never restrict another from making use of the Eruv unless there are two Jews who restrict each other, right? So Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov says the non-Jew has no legal standing. And because they have no legal standing, they cannot add to the Eruv and they cannot take away from the Eruv. The case of a Jew who refuses the Eruv is much more difficult because they have legal standing being Jewish. And if they refuse to participate, then you are kind of stuck with them as a shared resident without a shared space.
The halacha is by whom?
The halacha is by the Talmud, but basically Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov takes the lead.
Oh, okay. Yeah, because it makes sense, because we saw something very similar with the houses, the distance of the houses. What happens when someone is not Jew, that you can kind of...
Right. Now we get a more specific case of what happens when you have a less than reliable Jewish member of your community. In this case, a Sadducee. Just a reminder, if you haven't studied other things, the Sadducees were a different sect of Judaism back in the days of the Second Temple. They had their own interpretation of Jewish law. One of the outstanding features was that they rejected the notion of there being what we would call the Mishnah. They rejected an oral law altogether. And so when it comes to the notion of an Eruv, of course they reject that because the Eruv was a rabbinic, it was part of the oral law tradition. So here you have a Sadducee who would generally reject the idea of an Eruv, but you have an agreement, at least for the moment. That's where we set up this story. So Rabban Gamliel said, a Sadducee once lived with us in the same alley in Jerusalem. And father, meaning Rabban Gamliel's father, said, hurry up and carry out all vessels into the alley before he carries out his and thereby restricts you. So the idea was that they were worried that the Sadducee might renege, that he might go back on this agreement. And by moving his things out into the alley, he's showing his ownership of it, and therefore, into the courtyard, and therefore he's showing his ownership of it. And that means you've lost your permission to take your things out there. By having you put your things out first, it shows that you are claiming ownership of that space according to the agreement that you had, and therefore he cannot take it back now that it's already been established. Rabbi Yehuda argues that actually Rabban Gamliel's father said it a little differently. He said that the instruction was given in different language, different wording. Hurry up and perform all your needs in the alley before he carries out his and restricts yours. Again, the same idea being that you need to stake your claim in accordance with what was agreed upon before he does something which could revoke the permission that he has given.
What's the difference between them? It looks the same.
Well, they are, but remember the Mishnah and then later the Talmud care greatly about making sure the wording is exactly as the original was meant to be.
Yeah, but what is the difference between Rabbi Judah and what is the other one, and Rabbi Gamliel? That what they say is more or less exactly the same. Hurry and carry out all the vessels to the mayor, my boy, before he carries out and restricts you. And the other one said exactly the same. So why is repeating twice the same sentence?
So the idea here is that it's not just a case of what you have moved, it's also a case of whether you have used it at all.
But my question is, why repeating the same sentence twice? If it's exactly, no one add anything, any word, nothing.
No, but there is a difference. There is a difference. I mean, they are functionally trying to say much the same thing, but there is a difference, which is that if the Sadducee uses the space, not necessarily that he has carried everything out, but has used it at all, then that could show a sign of renouncing his permission for you to use it. right? Tzorchechem
The second one is using, and the first one is carrying.
Exactly.
It's not, my translation is not so clear, okay. Thank you.
Does that work?
Yes, now makes sense.
All right, so that is the end in this chapter of what to do with neighbors that are not Jewish or do not follow halacha the way the normative rabbis followed halacha. From Mishnah 3, it is a slightly different topic. Now we have people who are normally in the right zone, in the right mindset, but there is some forgetfulness. There's been an error in setting up the Eruv. So what happens in those cases? If one of the residents of a courtyard forgot to join in the Eruv, his house is forbidden both to him and to them for the taking in and for the taking out of any object. All right, so the idea was that for this type of Eruv, and again, put aside what you know about modern Eruvin, for this type of Eruv in a courtyard, the expectation was that each member of the courtyard would contribute something to the Eruv. Each person would either put a piece of bread in, or each person would put a bit of flour in that would be used to make bread on behalf of the whole courtyard. So here we have somebody who forgot to contribute to that Eruv. Again, don't worry about modern Eruvin, just worry about the case before us. So he forgot. So that means he doesn't officially join into the courtyard Eruv. So what's the halacha? Well, the halacha is that he can't take anything out of his house, and he can't take anything from the courtyard into his house, right? His house becomes off limits. And for the other members of the community, they can't bring things into his house, and they can't take things out of his house. His house is basically cut off for carrying during Shabbat. However, but their houses are permitted both to him and to them, meaning that they can come and go, of course, within their own houses and among their own houses and the courtyard and carry the whole time. He can also carry from the courtyard into one of their houses and from their house into the courtyard.
So he can, cannot.
He can. It is okay for him to do that, right? Because he basically becomes like a guest of the courtyard, and guests always have the same rights as the owner of the property.
So what's the difference? Are they the same?
No. The difference is his house becomes off limits to everyone. No carrying in and out of his house. Not by him, not by them.
Okay.
But all the other houses of the courtyard, everyone can carry in and out of them, including him. Right?
To
so
the
he has
houses and also to the courtyard.
Exactly. So if he goes to his next door neighbor's house and he picks up a chair and he carries it out the door into the courtyard, that's fine. If he goes to his house and picks up a chair and carries it out of the courtyard, that's prohibited.
Can he carry within the courtyard from one end of the courtyard to the next?
As long as it is within the courtyard, yes. It's just can't go across his threshold.
All right.
So he can take everything from his house to the courtyard, but not to the other houses.
No, he can go, hold on. Just a second. We're going to do another picture because without pictures, this is hard.
Could you also that they do it in order to avoid free riders and making sure that everyone takes responsibility of the Shabbat and the roof?
Yes, so that's a general rule, yes. However, there's a reason why. There we go. All right, that's going to make things a little bit clearer. Oops. Sorry, too many different buttons. All right, so there is the forbidden house.
Mm-hmm.
All right, all the other houses, they remembered and they participated and they got in on the Eruv. All right, we'll just make another layer over there. All right, so We're going to use a little heart here, and then I'm going to move it around. All right, so if there is something in the courtyard and the guy who forgot moves it into this house, he's okay. If he takes it from this house and moves it in the courtyard, he is okay. If he takes it from this house and goes to this house, he is okay.
He can move also. He personally can move.
He himself can do this, no problem. If he takes it from the courtyard and goes into his house, meh.
No.
And if he takes it from his house and leaves into the courtyard, meh, it is not allowed.
So
And
the only
if-
problem is the relation, the connection with his house. If he doesn't touch his house, like bringing and taking stuff from his house, everything, he can do everything else.
Yes, and other people have the same restriction. So if somebody lives in this house and they pick up the little heart, they can move it anywhere, but they cannot go into his house. His house is off limits for everyone for carrying.
But what about physically? Can, for
Oh,
example,
you can
a
walk.
neighbor,
You can walk. Yeah.
can they walk a neighbor to his house?
Yep. Walking is no problem, but you cannot carry out of his house or into his house. So, yeah, all of these discussions are only about the carrying on Shabbat, not about walking.
Does it make a difference if you're 10 cubits above ground? More than 10?
Yes, and we're not going there right now.
Oh.
We're not going to deal with hovering, and we're not going to deal with things that are like crawling along the ground. We're dealing with normal situations. So yes, more than 10 cubits above where you actually have construction is generally considered another domain. But we're not gonna go there right now. Okay. Now we get to the second half of the Mishnah. If they gave their part of the courtyard to him, he is permitted, but they are forbidden. All right, so let's imagine that they're very, very nice people, and they know that he's also a really good cook, and he's prepared a huge meal for the courtyard. And they were going to set up the table, and they were going to set up all the food from his house, but for whatever reason, he forgot about the eruv, right? Just work with me on the imagination here. If they say, that's okay, we relinquish our control of the courtyard to you, then for that Shabbat, it becomes an extension of his house. And then you could take things in and out of his house. But now, because they relinquished it, you can't carry in and out of their houses at all.
No, they have only his house, because it's beneficial from his house, or his house is the main one.
Exactly. They basically transfer the ownership over to him. Well, the rights of usage is a bit more correct. And that gives him permission and them to go in and out of his house. But now their houses are off limits. And if I knew how, I would change the colors on the map to be exactly the opposite.
Mm-hmm.
Aaron, I see your hand.
Yes. How many people have to relinquish the courtyard? Does it have to be unanimous or majority?
It has to be all of them. And that's actually going to become a problem when we get to the third part of the Mishnah. And let me just move to the mouse. I forgot that. Trying to still remember these things over here on the side for those you are reading at home. Of course, you can go to Safari yourself too. If there were two, meaning two guys who forgot to join in the eruv, they restrict each other because one may give his part and also acquire the part of others, but two may give their parts but may not acquire the parts of others. So what they're trying to say here is, let's imagine, I'm just going to put it in another color. Oh, got to go to draw. Let's imagine we've got one more house, right? And let's imagine that both that house, come on, this house and that house, oops, each forgot to be part of the eruv. Well, they can all give up their rights for one person. That's fine, but he can't give up his rights because he did not gain the rights as part of the the original partnership, right? One can give up his part and he can acquire from the others. So Mr. Red can get from everyone else who was as part of it. However, Mr. Red and I think that's green, right? Mr. Red and green cannot both acquire from everyone else. When everyone else gives up their ownership, they have to transfer it to one person. They can't transfer it to multiple people. So they could give it all to Mr. Red, but Mr. Green would still be out of luck. Does that make sense to everyone?
Yes.
Okay. And this all got rolled back. Angalia, the courtyard, shared, and 4. There we go. Okay. When must they give their share of the courtyard? Okay, so tell me, when do they actually do this whole relinquishing of the ownership? Beit Shammai says, while it is yet day, meaning before the sun has gone down, while it is still clearly Friday day, then that's when you need to do this. Basically because Beit Shammai sees this as being a legal act, and legal acts need to be done before Shabbat begins. The place where this is the most classic example in the modern world, where we still do some Jewish legal acts like this, is Kol Nidre. Before Kol Nidre begins, whether it's on Shabbat or just a regular Yom Kippur, before Yom Kippur begins, we need to do Kol Nidre, because Kol Nidre is technically a legal act, and therefore it has to be done before Shabbat. Beit Hillel, on the other hand, says after dusk, or really even after dusk, meaning that you can relinquish at any time during Shabbat. That because it is not really a business transaction, but just a convenience in order to make life simple, you can relinquish it at any time you want, even if it's on Shabbat. I see your face, Nathan.
I agree more with Beit Shammai.
Which is not the first time.
No, but because logically, like you said, it's a document. Because if not, you become to have a very, you create kind of, I know, extra flexibility. You don't like loopholes. Okay? Extra flexibility. You say, oh, you know what, you forgot. That's okay. You can create something new on Shabbat. And you don't want to create a new reality on Shabbat. It's against the main idea. So that's why we need to cross everything, what you are thinking about, what you are your intentions before the Shabbat. That is in general what we learn in the Masechet Shabbat.
Yes, but remember, Eruv is a special category, right? Eruv is a category where the rabbis were willing to let people be lenient because they knew that it was already a stringency in the first place. So the entire theme of Eruvin is that it should be more lenient than many other categories of Jewish law. However, I should point out that it's an unusual feeling always to say, well, if it's just a loophole, does that mean I'm allowed to do it? And Judaism has a very broad discussion about how we feel about loopholes. On the one hand, what you're saying is absolutely normal, right? If you have loopholes for everything, then like nothing really matters and it just becomes a joke. And on the other hand, if loopholes are the actual correct interpretation of the Torah and Jewish law, then it's not a loophole, it's a feature. It is built into the structure, right? If I lock myself out of my house and my window is open, if I enter my house through the window, that's not me using a loophole, that's me using another opening into my house. It may not have been the normal opening, it may not be the opening I would use every day, but it's not illegal for me to go into my house through my window. I'm not exploiting something. That's how the house was built. It was built so there was a hole there. And if that hole happens to be useful to me sometimes, why should I not use the hole? So having an opinion for or against loopholes really kind of is not the main idea, right? It's having, the idea should always be what is the clearest and most accurate understanding of the structure of the law. And if there is an opening here, then I can use it. And if there is a smaller but still sometimes useful opening here, I can use that. That doesn't mean I should. It doesn't mean that it's like the one I should do most often. But if it's there, it's there. And why would I refuse to use it if there was a need?
We have a lawyer here, but I think that that the rule of the law, the most important feature is consistency. And when you start going around what is the short, but what is the most expedient, or whatever you explain, you are destroying consistency. Okay, and I think that it's very important that the rule of the law must be equal for everyone in as much as possible every situation. So you create consistency and precedent, so people can feel that is a fair game. That's the way to work. So it's very clear how you need to work. When you have so many things, outliers, that can confuse people.
So I'm going to do one more drawing to sort of explain again, or explain a different way what I have found from how Judaism handles the deviations you're talking about. If I'm driving along the road and the road goes like this, would I be a better driver? Hold on. If I drove like that, does that make me a better driver? The road is the bent road, but the consistent road would be for me to drive straight ahead no matter what. But that's not the shape of the law. The law has bumps. Those bumps are not problems. Those bumps are just where the law goes. The same way that the road sometimes goes a little left, sometimes goes a little right, sometimes goes up, sometimes goes down. If I'm following the road, that makes me a good driver. That doesn't make me a reckless driver who should just keep going straight no matter what. Right? Consistency isn't a virtue by itself. Consistently following the law, that's a virtue. And when you realize the law moves, meaning that the law has features and structure that is not so straight always, then you have to learn how to actually follow the law. The reason the Mishnah and the Talmud especially are so long is because the rabbis want to know the exact contour of the law. They don't want to just say, meh, just be strict, or meh, just be lenient. They want to know the precise shape.
No, I understand. You say what I try to say is the other side that I see is that when you don't have a very clear path, okay, for any reason, for people that are not very learner, it's very difficult to understand what to expect and how to proceed, and can confuse people. When you have the rules very clear and basic, that it summarized in a very simple way, people can know what to expect and how to move on. Okay, and there's no surprise. They don't have unexpected situations.
Okay, so you are absolutely hitting on a key concept of how Jewish law works, right? And that is that we are talking about the law here in a fairly abstract structure, but the real law was in the community. It was in a group of people, not just one person. You know, one thing that I really love from Hebrew is that it has a plural you rather than just a singular you. So when you said, you know, what are you going to do? It's like not just what you ata, right? It's you atem, it's the group. And then you'll learn what is the way the group follows the rules in these situations. And that is what prevents the one difficulty or perhaps even danger of following the law so carefully and knowing its contours, is that you will be guided by the group to avoid going across the line. And that is something that is very hard to recreate in the modern world, because as Jews, we often live unconnected. There are some more insular communities that have that social reinforcement, and that is one perk of the Orthodox lifestyle. There are lots of negatives also, in my opinion, of course, but that was something that was just natural in every community, Jewish or non-Jewish, for all of history. And one of the things, not to get on my soapbox, that is very much missing in the modern world for any community is the sense of community, the sense of where are we going as a group, rather than just the individual saying, this seems good to me, and not hearing all of the other reasons and not seeing all of the other life that might guide them in a better direction. Loopholes aren't a problem if you have a whole group telling you don't use the loophole. Loopholes are only a problem if it's one person justifying it to themselves with their own rationalization.
And what happens, Rabbi, if someone comes from outside, from a different community, and doesn't know the rules of that place, of that community, and he can make many mistakes?
Yes.
Will be the rabbinical court more lenient with that person because he's not from that community, so he doesn't know the rules of a society?
Yes and no. It depends on the type of rule that you're breaking. If you cheat someone in business because that's the way we did it back in my hometown, the court's not going to be as lenient. On the other hand, if you observe Shabbat in a way that does match one interpretation of halacha, but not the one of this community, then absolutely the court is not going to take you out and flog you. But they are going to say that's not the way we do it here. Right? That's not the minhag hamakom. That's not the custom of the place of how we observe that halacha. Aaron.
Yes, Rabbi. Back to the consistency in the law argument that Natan was making. How come it seems like the Mishnah does not go very far in depth into the reasoning of the law versus the application of the law? So if you're trying to make it consistent with the reason of the law, you don't see too many arguments for that. They're all based on, or mostly based on, the application of the law, at least in the commentary.
And that's not a bug, that's a feature. So first of all, I just want to repeat, the Mishnah was not meant to be the only thing you learned. The Mishnah was meant to be your class notes from what you learned.
I'm talking about the commentary with all the notes on it, though. They don't go too far in depth into the purpose of the rule.
Right. So the other side of that, in addition to the fact that the Mishnah itself would have been explained with a bit more of purpose and reasoning and underlying logic, is that ultimately purpose and reasoning and underlying logic was considered less valuable for understanding law than actual practice. This is very different than American legal systems, although we still do value precedent in American law. American law, people love to talk about, what is the reason, and look at the Federalist Papers and all of those kinds of things of what was the intention of the author. Jewish law says, no, what did they do? Because what they did, that we can build off of. What they thought, we can't get inside their head. And there's a third reason, which is the ultimate reason for the law is God's. And that definitely we cannot get inside of. We can hypothesize and we can speculate, but your guess of why God gave this commandment versus another one may be very different than my guess of why God gave this commandment rather than a different one. But the one thing we have to agree on is God gave this commandment. And we can interpret that according to the words of the Torah, as they have been interpreted by our sages. And then we can apply it based on the precedent that we have seen in the practice of the community and use that as our main yardstick. And we can sit back and speculate about the reasoning and the underlying principles, and then we can apply them to new cases and try and spin more additional understanding for things that are not covered directly. But the things that are covered directly, those are the things. And that's where we stand.
But Rabbi, two things I was going to say. First of all, didn't Rambam say for almost all of them, not quite all of them, but almost all of them, that if you study them hard enough, you'd be able to infer the reason behind them? And isn't there knowing the reason behind the rule necessary to modernize? Because if you're doing it for the sake of doing it, then you're stuck in the traditionalist mindset. If you have the reason, then you can modernize it.
So going to Rambam basically believed in philosophical inspiration, meaning that if you thought and reasoned hard enough about anything, then eventually, if you were lucky, you would have a philosophical or Ruach HaKodesh, heavenly spirit that would guide you to understand the reason behind it. But that didn't mean that you could adjudicate on that. That didn't mean that you could then take and stand up in the court of law and say, an angel told me this was the reason. That's not admissible in Jewish law. So yes, it is definitely true that we should try to understand the reasons and stretch our mind as best as we can to hopefully catch a glimpse of what we think the reason is. But as far as it comes to actually using that glimpse to make law or to interpret law, there are severe limitations on that, because your insight is not my insight. And that means that if it's not open to examination by everybody involved in the discussion, it is not admissible in the discussion. Right? That's why in Judaism, your feelings don't matter when it comes time to discuss the law. It's interesting. I care about your feelings, and your feelings may lead you to examine certain issues more than others. Nothing wrong with that, right? We look at the law that matters to us most. But if you say, I think the law should be A because it feels right to me, and that's your whole argument, then you haven't made an argument. All you've done is shared an opinion, and I appreciate that and all, but you're not going to adjust anyone else's thinking just because you feel it really, really strongly. You have to give me some proof. Now that proof can be quotes, that proof can be analysis and logic, but it has to be something that I can look at and I can take apart and examine. And the things that we examine most are the text that we have and the precedent that has come from it.
Right, but Rabbi, I mean, shouldn't you be able to, using your logic, reasoning, and examination of the text, if you can't provide any kind of reasoning for the law, then how are you supposed to modernize it when you're just doing what it says without reasoning?
So Sir Isaac Newton, right, worked out the whole gravity thing, except he didn't. Right? Isaac Newton used reasoning to figure out how fast gravity attracted things and the whole idea of, the laws of attraction. But he had no idea why that was the law of attraction. He had no idea what it was about matter and the universe that made things come together with a gravitational force. He just worked out from his observation, from the examples before him, how that happened. And then, yes, he deduced a law or a general principle, but he did not understand the reason behind why that was the general principle. So the rabbis are not averse to looking for general principles. But they look for general principles not just by thinking about it, not just by speculating about the motivation of the lawgiver, but the general principle that would account for all of the phenomenon that we can witness.
But when Einstein came, 80 years later or something, and did understand gravity, he was able to do so much more than Newton's theory.
He was, except Einstein also didn't understand gravity. Right? Einstein understood a more in-depth and useful interpretation of gravity for certain supermassive objects, bigger than things on Earth. But Einstein also doesn't know why there is gravity. Right? We still don't know exactly how gravity works. Right? There are no gravity particles as far as we can tell. And I know Einstein gave that wonderful image of like the Earth, the curvature of space and all of that. But that's really more of a mental apparatus rather than an actual description of how the universe really looks. So,
go ahead.
Go ahead. No, I was just going to say, so we still lack a full understanding of the mind of the creator of the law of gravity and the meaning behind it. We're just able to use it better because he observed more phenomenon and saw how the law was applied in all those other cases as well. Whereas Newton looked mostly at the phenomenon that were very easy for him to see and measure. Einstein had more opportunity to measure things that were more complicated and more abnormal.
But the more we understand it, the more we're able to do and accomplish in a better way.
Right, but the understanding doesn't come by figuring out the reason behind it. The understanding comes by seeing more categories of its behavior and then coming up with a law that covers more of those categories than the original statements. And that's the same principle in Jewish law, right? The more examples you have, Rabbi so-and-so did this, Rabbi so-and-so did this. It works like this for business. It works like that for marriage. The bigger of a catch-all understanding you can get. But you have to base it on those real examples, on those concrete manifestations of the law at work, rather than just reading the book about the law in the abstract.
Right. But then 200 years later, though, people might be doing things differently because those reasons no longer exist on why they did it that way in the first place.
Baruch Hashem. That's fine. Right? Thank God. Right? The application of the law does not mean that we should be trapped in how it is applied and how it is manifest in any given century. But
understanding the reasons on why they did it in the first place, you don't know if the changes are right or not.
So I can't remember because there was such a huge screen when we were on the Tikkun Leil Shavuot. Were you there for the discussion of when Moshe Rabbeinu saw Rabbi Akiva?
Yeah, that was at Shavuot.
Yeah, that's what I said. The Tikkun Leil Shavuot. Yes. So, you know, when he was in the room, he had no idea what was going on. Moses did not understand the law as Rabbi Akiva was teaching it. Why? Because Rabbi Akiva had come and the generations before him had come, and each one had continued to apply and understand the law as they needed and they could for their community and their generation. And by the time it reached Rabbi Akiva, 1,000+ years from Moses, the structure of the law sounded very differently. But when Rabbi Akiva explained that it came from Moses, that was the original example, the original case study, and it was out of that and all of the things that came from it, Moses understood, yes, this is the same law. It may not look exactly the same, but it is the same law. You know, we'll go back to Yom Kippur again. We do not celebrate Yom Kippur the same way that our ancestors did. Most of what we do and most of what they did would be unrecognizable to us. Right? We have no goats, we've got no altar, we've got no slaughtering, we've got no incense on and no holy of holies to go into. Right? We do not have a high priest that is saying God's ineffable name. All of the things that they consider to be quintessential Yom Kippur, we don't have. Okay, we still have the fasting, and we still have the vidui, the confession of our sins, and the tshuva, but those are like footnotes in the actual text of the Torah. Those are not the things that the chapters about Yom Kippur spend most of their time on. And I imagine for most of our ancestors, they thought of Yom Kippur as being the temple service. They didn't think of Yom Kippur as being just their own self-reflection. They did that, I'm sure, and that's what they were taught to do. But that still wasn't like really what Yom Kippur was. Yom Kippur was the temple service. And it took a catastrophe before people began to realize that the temple service didn't have to be done in the temple as a service, but instead there were other ways to accomplish the same goal, because the Torah and the other texts hinted that there were other ways to accomplish that same goal. Otherwise, if we had been following the same halakha that they did in 70 when the temple was destroyed, Judaism would have been destroyed with it. Joseph, I saw you again.
Oh, go ahead.
I was gonna say that also one other thing that would have been strange for our ancestors is the concept of the Pesach Seder, because the Pesach Seder is not even in the Torah. That was an invention of the rabbis.
Right. I mean, the Pesach sacrifice was, and the eating of bitter herbs, and that was there. But
the concept of the Seder doesn't exist.
Right. When you come to my house, you're not going to find a dead lamb that was sacrificed at the altar of Jerusalem. Mm-hmm. And I mean, that was like the key component, but it's not there now.
Yeah. But Rabbi, without the examination on the change of law, don't you need the logic on and changing the law to make sure you arrive at the point that Rabbi Akiva arrived at, instead of when Moses came from the mountain and saw the golden calf?
So how do you make sure you don't drift too far? That's why you have links in a chain, right? No one person is able to just sit down and say, I'm going to reinterpret it from the Torah to myself. To do that, you start a whole new religion. Right? You go to Christianity, you go to Islam, you say, I'm going to recreate, okay, fine, there's one God, but I'm going to recreate everything else afterwards. And that's basically what happened with the other Abrahamic religions. They jumped from giving of Torah to where they wanted to be, and there's no linkage in between it. But in Judaism, you can trace ruling by ruling for many, many of the generations, exactly how we got to where we are. And indeed, that's what modern rabbis do. If someone asks me a question about marriage or about electricity or anything that's had new innovations in the last 100 years, I don't only read the Torah. I don't only read the Mishnah. I don't only read the Talmud. I read the other texts that come in between them and me to see what sort of understandings of all of these has there been, and then what would that mean in the situation that I see to the best of my understanding of this situation. And then I compare my understanding to the understanding of other colleagues. And then we bat it back and forth and come to either a consensus or each to our own solid but personal, in terms of rabbinic understanding for their community. Natan.
But Rabbi, with your respect, okay, that's your, and I agree with you personally, but that's your interpretation of Judaism as a conservative rabbi. If you go to an Orthodox or you go to any other branches of Judaism, they disagree with you completely how you see Jewish law.
Right.
All the flexibility that I think is very positive to adapt and not die like a dinosaur, okay? You can keep adapting. You need the flexibility that we had until the 18th century, okay, 19th century. I agree with you, but not everyone see from that perspective. People say, oh, you know what, it's too much, I cannot recognize the Judaism. Okay, we are going that reform conservative movement, they change so much that also when you see books from people that are modern Orthodox or more pluralist in Israel, they try to keep distance with the Masorti movement because say, wow, those are going to changing everything, okay, that we cannot recognize what is Judaism. So,
Right.
And I think that I think what Aaron tried to say, that you need to put some limits how much you can adapt or change based in a rational life, in a rational idea. What is the main idea? What are the main concepts? So you need to know what is the rationalization behind everything, the reason, in order to not, I don't want to say box, but at least draw some red lines, okay, how much you can change.
All right, so there's a lot there, and it's a shame that we're coming up on our time, but I'm gonna go a little bit long. We're probably not gonna get any more Mishnah done tonight, but this is a huge, important conversation. So first of all, to borrow language from my wife's country, with all due respect to my esteemed colleagues among the Orthodox, the way that they interpret how Jewish law is done is incorrect according to 2,000 years of Jewish law. Right? Jewish law does not come with guardrails. Jewish law does not come with a red line limit. Jewish law has no pope that can tell us, beyond here there be dragons, do not go here. That is simply not the way any of the sages understood Jewish law until the 1800s. And the only time they began to think like that was when, as you said, they recoiled from the interpretation of the Reform movement. Now, I disagree with the Reform movement on many of their interpretations too. Absolutely. Huge, huge list. But the fact that they've made decisions that I don't agree with doesn't mean that Jewish law doesn't have its basic structure as I've been describing. Right? The fact that someone will drive a car into a crowd of people doesn't mean that we don't have cars. And unfortunately, or fortunately, depending upon your constitution and your ability to accept flexibility, there is no way to impose an external limit to what halakha can generate. Because to do so means you know where halakha needs to be. And the only people who can do that are the Nevi'im, or the prophets. And unless you are claiming that you actually have Ruach HaKodesh, that you are imbued with God's Spirit and can speak on behalf of the creator of what God wants for the Torah, how can you tell me where the halakha needs to be stopped? You can argue that, absolutely. And I believe that many good Orthodox rabbis do make very convincing arguments about this direction or that direction, this direction, that direction, and those are very fine, and many of them are very well argued and very well reasoned. But without the argument and reason coming from within the structure of the halakha, if it's being imposed by someone from the out, by fiat, by simple decree, then they are also going outside the structure of halakha. Right? There is no monarch that can limit the organic nature of halakha without them breaking halakha. Because to stand outside of it, to look down and say, here's where the border is to imply that you are separate and beyond the limits of the law. The law has to be found by those who are exploring it on foot, case by case, moment by moment, family by family, life by life, to explore the borders of halakha. And where it works, it works. And where it doesn't work, that border gets shut down. For a very long time, multiple wives was perfectly normal in Jewish life. 1,000 years ago, Rabbeinu Gershom said, you know what, not anymore. Right, we're not going to do that anymore. And he had his reasons, but whether or not his reasons were valid became less important than that they were agreed to by the community, and that border became limited.
Maybe
that was a choice.
Maybe he didn't like his mother-in-law.
Different issues on probably why he was inclined to do that. If you look at Rambam and his Mishnah Torah, one of the reasons why it was attacked was because he basically said, all you need to do is read the Torah and read the Mishnah Torah, my book, and you're good. And all the other sages said, Rambam, you're brilliant, but that's not how halakha works. You can never just write down the final answer and think you're done. Because if you don't show all the steps to getting there, which means tracking the precedent and analysis of all the sages, not just the reason, then you cannot make a convincing argument of what is the final status for this particular question. And even worse, you can't make a good argument for what a final decision should be in a new case that isn't precisely the case that you have listed in your book.
So you have a problem with Shulchan Aruch, because Shulchan Aruch is exactly the antithesis of what you say.
I have no problem with either Mishnah Torah or Shulchan Aruch. I have a problem with people who think that those are the answer key. Of people who think that all you have to do is read it, memorize it, and you're done. Because to do so is to make a mockery of what Jewish law is. Jewish law is built by 1,000 little decisions made by 1,000 great people over 1,000 generations. It is not something that was able to be reduced to what is essentially a relatively short book. And it's simply, that's not how Jewish law works. That is not its lifeblood. It's not about being captured permanently, frozen on a page for all time in the final analysis. It is about, this is one, very well reasoned, very insightful, and very helpful, because it usually will capture the vast majority of situations that we still encounter, of understanding what the law would be in typical cases. But as soon as you get outside, it's like Newtonian physics. Once you start talking about the sun, it doesn't work. It breaks down. Or when you talk about Einstein and you get to quantum physics, there's a limit at certain points of where these general models work, and then they don't. And that is something that even Rambam and even Shulchan Aruch, they can't write a law book that will be good for everyone for all time. It just simply doesn't work. I mean, remember, Shulchan Aruch was published first by Rabbi Joseph Caro, and it was rejected by the European Jews, right until Moshe Yisraelis, till the Ramah came and added his extra additional notes, right? Does that mean he rejected Shulchan Aruch? Yes, because he saw in that book a reflection of a culture that wasn't exactly his own. I mean, it was very, very similar, but he had to add more.
Yeah.
Right? Exactly. He had to adapt it for what it was in Ashkenaz. And yes, they agree on like 80% of the things, and that's great. And I agree in modern times that 80%, 90% of what's in the Shulchan Aruch is still applicable in a way that would absolutely still be recognizable. But that doesn't mean that Shulchan Aruch is the final word. There is no final word. There was only a first word, that's the Torah. Everything after that is commentary, as a very famous rabbi once said. Aaron, you still got your hand up.
Yes. Hey, Rabbi, going back to the Mishnah Torah, though, wasn't that originally supposed to be for the average person and not meant to be the law for all time, so that somebody could look up the law and see what at least Rambam believed it was at that time in that community and the surrounding communities?
No, not exactly. Actually, the Mishnah Torah was partly for the average person, but the average person was supposed to be mostly guided by his teachers and rabbis. It was more for the advanced student. In Rambam's introduction, which doesn't get studied enough in my opinion, he basically says, look, everybody's wasting their time studying Talmud. Why are they doing this? Rambam would have hated Daf Yomi, because the whole idea of why would the average people need to know the Talmud? Okay, fine, maybe if you're a Dayan, you need to really study some of this. But really, if you're an advanced student of Torah, you should know the Torah, you should know the basic halacha, and then you should go study philosophy, right? Use your mind for something that will get you closer to God. These are Rambam's words, which is philosophy, astronomy, and all the sciences. That will help you truly uncover the mysteries of God. Right. But Talmud, why would you need to study this? I'll tell you how the argument is finished. I'll tell you what the result is. Here, read it, you're done. Good. Do something better.
I should have said it wasn't meant to be a reference guide for somebody who wasn't supposed to be interpreting law, though, or wanted a reference. It wasn't supposed to be the end-all, was it?
Except even as a reference guide, by itself, it is not ideal, because there are no footnotes. There's no explanations of why he interpreted certain Talmudic arguments to resolve in the way he did. For all the reasons, much that you were already complaining about, it is a useful starting place, but it really isn't a very good reference guide in and of itself. It wasn't until someone went through and wrote in all the footnotes for him in the centuries that came later, and some others began to write commentary to explain why he might have made the arguments he made, that it began to become a more useful, broad-term reference guide for studying law in general. It really was not very useful to someone who wanted to study the law if they didn't already know as much as Rambam did, which, most people didn't.
And didn't he contradict his Mishnah Torah in a number of his responses?
Well, to show that he continued to evolve and understand his law differently in different cases, and to understand that nuances of one case that look similar to another might lead to a different ruling. Yes, that's not contradiction. That's being a good judge. All right. Well, thank you for the stimulating discussion. It's as you can tell, it is a pet topic of mine. It's unfortunate that over the last 200 years we've had a very reactionary version of what law should be. And that is primarily due to the revolutionary movements of Europe in the 1800s and then 1900s, and the disruption that came to society. And while, like I said, I do appreciate much of the intent of my esteemed colleagues among the Orthodox world, their interpretation of what Jewish law was and what Jewish law needs to be as a philosophical understanding of jurisprudence is in very large measure mistaken. You simply have to read law books written by Jews for Jews prior to the 1800s, prior to the 1700s, and you will not see that opinion. You will not see those ideas. And that is their innovation. That is their novelty, much like the Reform movement introduced their own. So yes, I'm a conservative rabbi. It's not surprising that my philosophy does match the conservative movement, but I do believe that the conservative movement of the three main movements best captures what Judaism has tried to be for the last 2,000 years. It's very hard to do that now, as Natan was hinting at, where we're very self-conscious of ourselves and it's not a natural organic process and we're adding new links and new interpretations every day rather than every decade. But it is still closest to the original form of how Jewish law was handled. And remember, because it's close to how Jewish law is handled, that means you also in your community can come to a different conclusion, which is also how Jewish law was handled. And you're all very welcome. I'm going to miss these conversations for a few weeks and look forward to getting back to it.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thanks, Rabbi.
Take care, everyone.
Thank you, appreciate it.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.